Milling Through History presents Isaiah Dorman. When it comes to the Battle of Little Bighorn, many people are, of course, familiar with that of George Armstrong Custer, Sitting Bull, the 7th Cavalry, the Indian nations involved in the battle. And yet, in this particular event in history, there was one individual whose story is oftentimes overlooked, if not completely forgotten. And that was the story of Isaiah Dorman. Now, what makes his story so unique? Well, he is the only African American to be killed at this particular battle. Dorman's story is a rather unique one, as it is a tale that goes from slavery to the Wild West and shows him as one of the earliest African American pioneers of the western United States. His date of birth is relatively unknown and could have been anywhere between the years of 1832 and 1840. Now, it has been suggested that Dorman was born a slave and owned by the Dormon family in Louisiana, but he would escape, finding his freedom by going out west to the Dakota Territory. Now, while living in the Dakotas, he would support himself by cutting wood for the local army garrison, and while living there, would interact with local Indian tribes. At some point, he would find himself going off to live with the Lakota Sioux, and during the 1850s would marry a woman by the name of Celeste St. Pierre, who was a member of the Santee Sioux. Now, within the Indian culture itself, he did find acceptance and had received two different names. For the Dakotas, he was known as Seton Sapa, or Black Hawk, while the Sioux would refer to him as Azimpi. Regrettably, there are no photographs of Isaiah Dorman, and so, while we have no real clear idea as to what he looked like, descriptions of him are unfortunately rather sparse. But the one thing that the descriptions do have in common is that they describe him as being a very big man, but also describe him as having very dark skin. In November of 1865, he was hired to carry the mail between Forts Rice and Fort Wadsworth for $100 a month. The journey was a 360-mile round trip, which he would do on foot, owing to the fact that Dorman did not own a horse. And so, walking back and forth for that distance, the $100 was certainly worth the expenditure. In September of 1871, he would serve as a guide and interpreter for the engineers of the Northern Pacific Railroad Survey. And it is believed that between 1871 and 1874, he would serve with the 7th Cavalry during their Black Hills expedition and was also referred to at that point in time as a servant for General Custer, who had referred to him as Isa. Now, this is a big stretch of the imagination when it comes to the truth, as there's no real way to prove if Dorman was actually the quote-unquote servant of Custer, but some historians believe that the two could be the same. By 1876, Custer would launch his expedition into the Black Hills and the Little Bighorn country, specifically targeting the Sioux Nation and hoping to conceivably wipe them out or deliver a fatal blow which should, in theory, be able to prevent any potential Indian uprising from occurring. Dorman was hired by Custer to serve as an interpreter. However, historians have some speculation that Dorman actually wanted to leave the 7th Cavalry before the unit would march out, but was ordered by Custer to stay behind. Now, when it came time for the battle, Dorman was not with General Custer, but instead was with Major Reno and was sent off with a detachment along with Reno to a different portion of the battlefield. Major Reno's forces would find themselves at the head of the Sioux Nation, and as they fought the Indians there, they were soon being overrun. Dorman himself was cut off from the rest of Reno's column as this portion of the 7th Cavalry retreated, and was soon left behind to fight on his own. Well, according to the accounts of the battle, Dorman came into the fight with a non-regulation rifle and was successful in killing many Indians. However, the number of Indians who were coming after him would soon overwhelm his position, shooting his horse out from under him and forcing him to fight pretty much from the ground upwards towards numerous braves. Dorman continued to put up a heavy fight, but eventually the numbers just became too many, as it was reported that at least a dozen Indians turned and opened fire on him, severely and mortally wounding him. And this is where also a unique story comes into play from the battle. Lying there on the ground, mortally wounded, Dorman looked up and saw Sitting Bull. Calling out to the Indian chief, Sitting Bull would stop his horse, get down, and offer Dorman water. Now, there is some speculation as to why this would occur. Some have argued that, according to Indian custom, when a request for hospitality occurs, one has to do this. Others point out that Sitting Bull was offering Dorman water to an old friend who once lived with him, but upon doing so, he said, "Now my friend is dead," and ignored Dorman as the Indians came to finish him off. While no one is 100% sure as to exactly what the final moments of Isaiah Dorman's life was, we do know that when his body was found after the battle, he was surrounded. It did seem as if there was a large fight that had occurred. His body, along with many others, were collected and would be interred at the Custer Cemetery at the Battle of Little Bighorn. And so, thus came into a life of a unique man, one for whom history has often forgotten, and yet his own unique aspect of history allows us to see just what it was that he had done to make himself such a unique figure in Western frontier lore. For more information, please consider these suggested titles. Be sure to click on the left-hand side of the screen to subscribe to our show, and on the right-hand side for our latest episode. And we will see you again for the next episode of Milling Through History.